Hello everyone and welcome to this video. So today we are going to build our own CSS Box Shadow Generator app from scratch. So this Box Shadow Generator app will feature an intuitive interface with adjustable sliders and color pickers, giving you full control over the blur, spread, color and position of your box shadows. You will see the changes happening in real time, making it easy to create amazing box shadows effects for your project. And once you generate your box shadows, you can copy the CSS code associated with that and then use it in your project. Not only are we going to build the app, we are also going to understand through the building of the app the concept of CSS box shadows. So by the end of this tutorial, you would have a fully functional app that you can use and customize in your future projects, and you would also understand the concepts behind box shadows in CSS. So before we jump into the coding magic, let me give you a small demo of what our final app will look like. So as you can see here, we have 3 sections. So here we have where we actually customize the box shadows. Here is where we have a preview of how the element is going to look like once we apply the settings on it. There's also the container properties. So for example, we can set the width and height of the container as well as the border radius. So if I increase the width, it is going to increase the width of the container. As you can see here from the preview, this is going to increase the height of the container as well, and this is going to change the border radius of the container. Here I can also change the color if I want, and once I am doing it, the CSS is also generating the code associated with that. Now when I come to the box shadow side, here I can add layers of box shadows. So for example, in CSS you can have multiple box shadows applied to one element. So as you can see, these are my box shadow layers. Now the first one, I can change the color. So for example, I can choose something much deeper and then increase the transparency as well, or the opacity. And then once I increase the horizontal length, as you can see from here, this is also the vertical length. Now this is the blur radius, so how blur your shadows should look like. And then this is the spread radius, so how big or small your shadows should be. Now there is this insert property, which is either going to place your shadows either inside the container or outside the container. Right. So these are all the properties you need to apply a box shadow on an element in CSS. So we are going to take this and then add a UI to it to make it look like this. So for example, if I add another box shadow here, I can customize this as well. So as you can see, the second box shadow here, I can change the color to something much deeper for you to see it properly, and I can change the vertical length as well as the horizontal length. I can change the blur radius and then the spread radius as well. So you can add as many box shadows as you want, just based on how you want to generate your shadows. So I mean, it's basically based on your preference. But once you are changing the sliders, the code is also generating here. So once you finish, you can basically be able to copy this and then you can add it to your project or your CSS. But another feature is probably when you don't need this box shadow, you can delete it. So for example, I can delete maybe the first one and it's going to go away. Right, so that is what the delete button is for. You can delete box shadows as well. So let's just jump into the code. You can grab your favorite code editor and let's get started. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so that you don't miss any future videos. Alright, so I'm going to bring my terminal and create a new React app using Vite. So I'm going to do npm create Vite at latest, and I'm going to give my project a name. So I'm going to call this Box Shadow Generator. I'm going to use React, and I'm going to choose TypeScript, Now I'm going to do cd box shadow generator, and then I will open it in VS Code. So my app is opened now, and I need to install the dependencies because I used Vite to create this app. I need to install this myself, so I'll do npm install. And whilst my dependencies are installing, I will clean up some of the files. So app.css, app.txt. I'll remove this one and then just put an h1 here and say hello world, at least for now. And then I would also clean up the index.css file a bit, just remove some of the things I don't need. Yeah, so the app is done installing. I'm going to be using Tailwind CSS for my styling. So when I open the website and I go to get started, then I'll go to framework guides. I'm going to be using it with Vite, so when I go there I see the installation instructions here. So basically I will copy and then I'll paste here, and then this will do the installation for me. So whilst this is doing the installation, I'm going to change the title here for now. So Box Shadow Generator. And I'm also going to change the icon being used here. I'll bring in the one I want to use. So it's an SVG file. Yeah, so box shadow.svg. And I'm going to change the href here to use that file. So once I save it, I see that the installation is also done. So before we run it, actually let's add the Tailwind imports and the configurations before. So I'll copy this one and then add it at the top of this file. And then I am also going to copy the config. So from here I'll just copy everything and then replace this one with it. Alright, so with that done, I think we can now try and then start the app and see if everything is working okay. So I'm going to do npm run dev. And as you can see here, everything is working fine. Our Tailwind styles looks like they've been applied. Yeah, so we can start working on our application now. Alright, so we are going to start with the layout, and inside app.tsx here I'm going to basically use a grid for my 3 sections I showed you. But first of all, I'm going to have a header. This is going to be the header of my application. So inside the header I'm going to use an h1, and I'm going to call it Box Shadow Generator. And yeah, just to also test Tailwind is working correctly, we are going to add some utility classes here. We are going to add some Tailwind classes here. So first of all, I'm going to say text blue dash 600, and as you can see the text color preview here, I'm also going to do text dash XL. So I get these suggestions as well because I have the Tailwind IntelliSense extension installed. So here, if you search for Tailwind, you see the Tailwind IntelliSense extension. You can go ahead and install this if you want to get those suggestions as well. Now I'm also going to do font medium, and once I save it, as you can see here, it is showing correctly. So I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm also going to get rid of these inputs, so I can do Shift Alt and then O just to clean up the imports. And then to give a bit of space on the header, I'm going to add class name here, and I'll add some padding. So I'll say padding 5, and yeah, as you can see. So after the header, I'm going to add a div this is basically where I am going to have my grid layout. So here, this is going to be my grid component. So class name grid. Now I want to say grid calls -1. So on smaller devices, the grid column is going to be 1, so that they will be on top of each other. But on large devices, I want to create a 5-column grid. So grid calls -5. So I am creating 5 columns because I want to give one to where I would have the box shadows, give 2 to the preview component, and then give 2 for where I'll have the code and then the container properties. So I'll add some gap here, and it's going to be 4. So in here I am going to have 3 elements, right? So this is going to be my 3 sections, and they are all going to receive some classes. So I'm going to say class name. I'm going to say call for column. I am going to also have a background for them. So say bg select -100. When I save it, we are not seeing it yet because I would have to add some content in there. So I'll add some padding 5. I'll add height 96 for smaller devices, and on large devices I want to say a height of full. So each full is basically going to be 100%. Now I'll add an overflow y auto, and as you can see, they are showing here. So this is basically where I am going to have my shadow layers. So I would say shadows. This one will be where I would have my preview container, and here I am going to have the container props and code. Alright, so as you can see here, so at the moment they are all columns and they are just taking 1 columns. So first of all, I want to move this because it is the same for all the other elements. I want to move this into a constant. So on top here I am going to create a constant, and I'll call it grid item styles, and I'm going to paste it here. So here, let me add UL. So here, instead of this, I can replace it with this. Right. And here I want to make the call span of 2 for this and this. So instead of this, I am going to do template string, and here I can add call -span 2, and I can do the same thing for the second one. So once I save it and I check it, as you can see, this is taking 2 columns, this is also taking 2 columns, and this is taking 1. I am now going to create my components. So I'm going to first of all create the shadows component, and that is what is going to contain my shadow layers. So here I'm going to add a new folder, components, and the first component I'm going to call it shadows.tsx. I'll do rfc to generate the initial template, and in here I'm first of all going to add a heading using h1, and I'm going to add some class name. So the heading is going to be box shadows. And here I am going to say the text should be large. I would have a font bold, margin bottom 5, and I'll place the text in the center. So once I save this, I come and use that component here instead. So I can import that, and then once I save it, yep, it looks like this. So after that, I'm going to have a button. So the button which says new layer, which lets you add a new layer. Right. So I'll put it in a div, and I'll have button. So I'll add some classes to style it. So it's supposed to be class name. Right. And I'll make it rounded. So I'll say rounded MD. The width should be full 100%, and I'll add some small shadow. So shadow SM, and I'll also add a background color. So BG blue dash 600, which means the text should be white. And then on hover, I want to deepen the background color a bit. So on hover, I'll say BG blue 700. And then inside here, I'm going to say new layer like this. And then once I save it, I should see it here. So I have to add some padding here. So I'm going to say padding Y2, and that gives some space inside. So after this, I'm going to have the box shadow layers that I am going to have, right? So I'm going to put a div here. For now, I'm going to put use state here. I'm going to leave it as, I'm going to give it an empty array. So this is going to be set state. I'm eventually going to change this to use context API, but I want to just add it here as a placeholder so that I can use it here. I'm eventually going to change it. This is what is going to store the list of shadow layers I am going to have. Right. So I'm going to store all my shadow layers in the state, and then I am going to basically do state.map, and what I'm going to have is a shadow layer, and for each of the shadow layer I'm going to put a template here how my shadow layers are going to look like. I will create a separate component for that, so I will call that component shadow layer. So that is going to be the name of the component, and because I'm doing a map, I need to pass the key. I'm eventually going to pass that, and I also need to pass the layer itself, that is the layer information, which is going to be shadow layer. And I'm also going to label my layers. So it's going to be layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 as I add them. So I'm going to use the index for that. So here I'm going to get an index as well. Remove that from here. Right, and I am also going to pass the index to this component so that I can use that index for the label numbers. Alright, so with this one, it means I have to create this component, the shadow layer component, which I am going to do right now. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it shadow layer.tsx. So I can add some classes here. So I'll add some pattern Y 5, and I'll add some border bottom 2. This one, because I'm using TypeScript, I want to add the type. So interface, I'll call it shadow layer props, and then it's going to accept the index, which is going to be a number, and then the layer itself. What is the layer going to contain? So I'm going to create that type. So inside this, I'll see I like to have like a model file for that. So I'm going to create model.tsx. The interface is going to be called box shadow properties. So I'm going to have an ID, which is going to be a string. Now these are the properties for my box shadows. So I have the horizontal offset, which is basically the horizontal length, vertical offset, the blur radius, spread radius, the color, and then the active or inset. So basically, if we leave it as empty, it is going to be outside, and if we set it to insert, it is going to be inside. So this is how my box shadow properties are going to look like. So I can now use that type here and import this, and here I can do index layer, and then basically this is going to be the type. And here I can even try and use the index here just for an example. So I'm going to save this, and then when I come here, I'm going to import this. So once I add a type here, which is going to be a list of box shadow properties, box shadow properties, and it's going to be a list. Once I add it here, it now knows that this is a box shadow property. So I can do, the key is going to be .id, and then I pass the layer here and then the index. So let's see what is going to go into our box shadow layer component. So in here is going to be the wrapper. Here I am going to have a div. I'm going to say class name. Going to do text right, and that is going to be for the delete button. So first of all, I would have the button at the top, and I'm going to add type is going to be button, going to add some class name, and here it's the delete, so I want to say bg red-500. I want to make it a text white, width 8, I want to add a pattern of 2, rounded, small. Now on hover, I want the bg to be a bit deeper, so bg red and then 600, and I want to add some small margin at the top as well, so I'm going to say margin top 3. So let me just put a delete here. I'm going to eventually change it to an icon. So let me actually install some of the packages I'm going to use for some of these. Right, as you saw from the finished app, my layers are going to be collapsible components, and with that I am using a package called react-collapsible. So I am going to install that, and so I'm going to do npm install react-collapsible, And with my color pickers, I am using React Color, so I will install that as well. Now I am also using uuid to generate random IDs. I will install that as well. And then I'm also using react-copy-to-clipboard, so when you want to copy the code. And the last package I will install is Monaco editor. Right, so Monaco editor / react. Alright, so I'll hit enter to install these packages. And also, because I'm using TypeScript, I'm going to install the types for some of these packages I am using, and I will install them as dev dependencies. So in a new terminal, I'm going to do npm install -d. So for example, React Color, I also need the types for React Copy-to-clipboard, and then the last one is going to be for uuid. So I am going to install these as well. Alright, so as you can see, all my packages are done installing, so I'll go ahead and use them now. I'm going to add a component here. I'm going to call it icons.tsx. I'm basically going to have some SVG icons. It's just a few of them I will use. So I will just copy and paste them here. But yeah, they are basically components that are exporting SVG elements, as you can see from here. So this is for trash, add, and then file icon. So I'm going to save this, and here I am going to use the trash icon for my delete button. So instead of delete, I will replace it with trash icon, import from icons. Going to save that. Now after this, I'm going to have another div. This is where I am going to have my color picker. So here I add margin top of 5. So the label, I'm going to use a P, and with that I'm going to say pattern Y 2. So the label is going to be color, and here I am going to have a color picker component. So call it color picker, and I am going to use React Color to create my color picker component. So inside here I'm going to create a new file called color picker.tsx. So here for the div, I'm going to have a class name. Now I'm going to say wrapper, going to make it relative, so the position is going to be relative. And then inside here I'm going to have a button with a class name. So the button, the width is going to be full rounded SM, border 2, and then the border color is going to be gray, 400, text black, and then the text is going to be small. So this is going to be my color picker. So it's basically a button. When you click on it, it shows the picker. So what I'm going to do is down here I'm going to have a div, and I'm going to use Chrome Picker from React Color. So let me show you the documentation for React color. So when you check React color, it contains some beautiful color pickers you can actually use. And then when you come down here, you'd see all the specific color pickers they have. Right, so for example, this block, there is Chrome, there is Circle, there's Compact, GitHub, Hue, Photoshop. So there are different color pickers, right? Yeah, so the one I am using is Chrome, and with that, as you can see, this one they are using Photoshop picker, and here swatches picker, sketch picker, right? So yeah, you can actually use any color picker you want. So the one I am using is this one, as you can see here, Chrome. Right. So this is how the Photoshop one looks like. This is the sketch one, GitHub Alpha, and this is the Chrome one. Right. So you just come here, and then based on the color picker you want, you can use it. So I'm using the Chrome picker, and here I need to pass the color, like the default color value, the color value, and then on change, that is when it changes. I'm going to pass an on change handler here. So because I want this component to be generic, I am going to pass these as props, so the color and then the on change, so that I can reuse it in different places. So I'll add that here. Alright, so this is going to be the interface color and then the on change, and then you can use the color results to do whatever you want to do with it. Right. So basically this color is what I am going to pass here. Now I'm going to add a div here. I'm going to add a style. It's called, the style is going to be cover. I'm going to create that very soon, and on click it's going to call this handle close, which I am going to create a function. So to show the color picker window, I'm going to use this state to manage it. So it's active, set is active, it's going to be a boolean. Let me import this, and then here I'm going to have some functions to close and open the window. So handle click is going to set it to the opposite, and then here handle close is going to set it active to false, and you would see what this is going to do shortly. So the thing I want to add is the style. So I want to add these two styles up here. So one is called pop over, and I'm basically doing position absolute z index, and this one is called cover. I'm doing a position fixed, top right, and then yeah, resetting the top right, bottom and left. And basically this one is what I am using here. I have the cover, and then with a pop over it is going to be the outer one. So this is going to contain a pop over. When you click on it, it shows the pop over, and then inside it is where you have the picker, color picker window. So now this handle click is now going to be triggered by the button. So this button is going to trigger the pop over to show the Chrome picker window. With this one, I am also going to add a background color to it. So I want the background color to be always the color we have selected, and here I want to also add the color here like this. So if I add a sample color So when I go here, you can add a mock. You can add a mock box shadow properties here. So this one, I need to make sure I do an import v4 as uuid from uuid, right, and this should go away. So when I save it, alright, so I can see the delete button. So here, if I import the color picker and I save this and I pass the correct props to it, so for example the color is going to come from layer.color, and then on change, and then on change I'm going to pass a function to it. I'm going to call it handle color change, and at the top here I'm going to create a constant handle color change. Right, and as I said, we would have the color results here, and I can get a type from color results, react color, and I can do, for now I can just do log and then log the color results like this. Alright, so once I save it, as you can see here, my color is showing here, and then here is showing the color picker window. So let's actually go to the color picker component again. So if we actually add some more content down here just to make the picker show, so lorem, actually let me do lorem 200 like this. Just to make this show. So if we come here, so to make this hide, we are going to do the check here. So we would say is active. So if it is active, then it's going to show the Chrome picker. Otherwise, it is basically going to show null or undefined. So once we do this, then it's not going to show initially, but once we click on it like this, then it shows. Once we click outside, then it goes away. Right. So basically that is how our color picker is going to be like. And if we check the console, once I open this and I choose a color, right, so this is the color results I am getting. I have the hex code here, I have the RGB, I also have HSL, and then this one as well. Right, so I have a color results of like the different color codes that I can possibly get. So if I want to use the hex, I can use this one. If I want to use the RGB color, I can use this one. This is the color results we are going to get and use. So my color picker component is done. I can now reuse it in any component I want. So I can close this one for now, and then I will get rid of this. So I have my button, I have my color picker. Now I am going to be creating my sliders, and with that I am going to create a component for that as well, so that I can reuse it. So I'll call it slider.tsx, and inside my slider.tsx, first of all I'm going to do refc to generate the initial templates. Inside here I'm going to add some class name, and first of all I'm going to have just margin y -6, And then inside here, going to have another div. This div is going to be a flex container. So class name flex. I'll do items center, and I'll do justify. So justify between. I'm going to add a paragraph 2. This is where I'm going to have the label. Right. So the label is going to be a prop, and here is where I am going to have the actual value. So if I adjust my slider and I have like 100 pixels, this is where the value is going to be. So the unit is going to be pixels, and here I'm going to add some styles. So here I'm going to say pattern y1, and for this one I'm just going to say text blue dash 600. Going to say font medium, pattern right 2. Alright, so let me now add the props, all the props our slider is going to receive. We are going to have a min value, a default min value, and also a max value. We would have the actual value. So this is going to say, okay, so you can't go below this min value, you can't go above this min value. This is going to be the actual value. There's going to be a label, and then on change event for when you drag the handlers of the slider. So let me import this from React, and basically I can destructure these here, right? And I need to add the type. Alright, so I'm using the value and then the label, but I am also going to use the other props on the input. So after this one, I'm going to put the input here. So the type is going to be a range. The main, we set a main property on an input, and it's going to be the main value, max value. The value is going to be the value. The onChange is going to be the onChange event. Right. So I'm going to style this as well. So I'll add the class name here, and this one I am going to say slider. Now I'm going to say bg dash gradient, and then to right. So I want to give it a gradient background. So in Tailwind you can do bg gradient and then 2. Alright, so the gradient is going from left to right, and then from left it is going to be blue dash 300, and then to the right it is going to be blue dash 200. Now I want to add rounded MD. I want to add appearance none. I want to add h3, height 3, and I want to say width full. So once I save it and I come here and I use the slider here, the first one is going to be for the horizontal offsets, so all the horizontal length. So here I am going to add the props. Right. So the main value is going to be negative 200, the max value is going to be 200. Now the value is going to come from layer, as we passed here. So layer.horizontal offset. Now this is going to be the label. I'm going to call it horizontal length, and then the onChange is going to call this handle slider change function, which I am going to put up here. So this is going to be the function handle slider change, and for now it's just going to do some logging. So here, let me import this. So on change handle slider change, and for now this is going to just do a console.log, and I will save this. And as you can see here, we have the slider showing, right? So for now I can't change it because I don't have the on change event handle doing anything. So we can copy and then paste it for all the other properties we are going to be needing. Alright, so as you can see here, I've done for the vertical offset as well, with the label vertical length, blur radius, and then the spread radius as well. Now the last thing I need to add is the insert, which is basically going to be a checkbox. So I'll just put an input with type checkbox here. Alright, so the checkbox is showing here, so I need to add the label as well, and then I need to add some classes here. So it's basically going to be a flex container, and then yeah, it's going to put this one here, justify content between, just like this. We are going to have when we add a new layer, it's going to add another component containing these elements down below. And as you saw from the finished app, this is going to be like an accordion component, and the package I used to do this is called react-collapsible, as we installed. So this is going to be a collapsible element, basically an accordion element. So on top here, after this, I am going to put collapsible from react collapsible, that component here, and I'm going to put the closing tag here. Now what are the props it accepts? So trigger, so the trigger could be a text, right? So you can have a label here, and then we can also have the default open, or the default open item, right? So we would say open it by default if index is equal to 0. We pass index here. So once we save it, we would now have a collapsible, right? So when I click on it, it actually works, and I can see the label here. I want to change the trigger to be layer, and then I'm going to pass index here. Alright, so I'm going to use template string, right, like this. So because we have only one item, it's saying layer 0, but we basically wanted to start from 1. We know the first item in an array is going to be it's going to have an index of 0, but we want it to start from 1, so we are basically going to do just +1 here, and yeah, we have layer 1. Alright, so before we add our preview and our container props component, we are going to set up our state so that we can update our state using these sliders and the color we get here. Alright, so one thing I want to fix is the height of this component, this section. So I want to make it fit the height of the viewport height of large screens. So I'm going to use the calc function for Tailwindcss to do that calculation. So I'm going to do that in app. So here, this is where I have that container. So after here, now I want it to happen on large devices, so I will do LG. right, and then the height dash. So here is where I want to use the calc function, right? So in Tailwind CSS, the way you do it is you bring a square bracket like this, and then you write calc, and then here I am going to do 100 VH, and then I want to subtract 5 rem from it. So once I do it, I see that this is now expanded down, and I feel like this is good enough, so I am going to leave it like this. Right, so 100 VH minus 5M, and yeah, it's going to fill the viewport height. So with that in place, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to set up the context so that we can actually start using some states in here. So here I am going to collapse this. I'm going to create a file in src, and I'm going to call it context. So in here, first of all, I'm going to do export constant app context, and then I'll call the create context function. Right, and I'm going to pass null here for now, so let me import it from React. And here, because I want to type it, I'm going to do I app context, and I'm going to create this interface in model. So I'm gonna have the state. So in my state, this is what I am going to have in my state. So I'm going to store the box shadows, which is going to be a list of box shadow properties, and I'm also going to store container props. So basically the properties we are going to apply for the preview container. Right, and I need to also add the type for container props. So as you saw from the finished app, our container is going to contain just the width, height, border radius, and then background color. So if I add that here, this is what my state is going to contain, the 2 properties. So here in my context, I'm going to have the state, and then what are some of the actions I am going to dispatch using my context. So some of the actions I'm going to do: add new layer, for adding a new box shadow layer, and it's going to be a function. And also I would have remove layer. This is also going to be a function, but a function is going to accept a parameter, which is the ID of the layer we want to remove, the shadow layer we want to remove. So apart from this, I am also going to have a function called set shadow property. This is also going to be a function, and then I am also going to have set container property. And this is going to be a function as well. So these 2 functions are what we are going to use to change these properties when we adjust the sliders. So set shadow property is going to change these properties for the box shadow. So for example, if I am adjusting the horizontal length, it means that we are going to dispatch this set shadow property, and then make sure we pass a key to it so that it will know we are adjusting the horizontal length, and it is going to update the horizontal offset property. Right, so it means here we are going to actually tell it the box, since we are going to also have a list of box shadows, we are also going to have to pass the ID of the shadow we want to update. So first of all, we need an ID. We also need a key, which is basically going to be a shadow property. So let me call it shadow key. Shadow key is going to be one of these. So if we want to update the blur radius, then I am going to pass the key as blur radius so that it will update the blur radius. And the reason why I am doing it like that is I don't want to set up I don't want to set up a single function for each of these property. So for example, if I want to change this one, I would have a dispatch function that changes just this, and I would have one for all of these properties, right? I just want to have one function, then I am going to pass a key to it so that it will actually, based on the key, change the property value. So the shadow key is going to be key of box shadow property. So here we want to say key of, so one of these keys, box shadow properties, and the last parameter we are going to pass is the actual value, the updated value we want to set, and that is going to be one of these values. So the way I'm going to type it is I'm going to say box shadow properties, and then if I do this, I'm basically selecting one of these properties, and then it is going to pick the type, which is basically the value for that, and then I am going to pass just exactly what I did here. Right, and then this is going to update the value, and here we are going to do similar thing for this. Right, so basically we are going to, this is going to be one. We are not going to have a list of container properties. We are only going to have just an object, because the container is always going to be one. So with that one, it is not going to be a list, so we wouldn't need the ID. So the only thing we are going to need is a key, and in this case it is going to be one of these. Right. So what is the key going to be? The key is going to be a key of container props. So just like I did here, and then the value container props, and then we need to pass this. So I need to change this to this. So this is the same thing I'm doing here. I can use generic types. So what I can do is here I can do maybe K, which stands for key, and then I do extends key of container props. Right, and then instead of this I can now use K, like that. So this is basically going to be the keys we have here. It's the same thing, right? So I can actually do the same thing for here as well. Close the model file for now, and here I am going to import context from model. Now because I want to set it as now, I am going to do as any. I'm going to have the default properties per set here. Right, so this is going to be the default box shadow props, and then the default container props. That's because I want to give them default values, and that's going to be my initial state for the shadows and then the container. So if I import these, and I also fix the UID import, Yeah, this should be resolved now. Now I can actually set my initial state, and here I'm going to import the state as well. So box shadows, and then I am adding the default box shadow props. It's going to be a list, so I just add the first one, and as you can see, I'm just spreading it here, and I'm doing the same thing for the container props as well. So here I am going to export a function, and I'm going to say export function and then context provider. So this is going to be my context provider, and here I'm going to pass children, and I need to add the type for that. So children is going to be React node. Now inside here, I'm going to do return app context dot provider, and here I'm going to pass the value. It's basically going to be an object, and within here I'm going to pass the children. So I'm going to use this component, and then when I use it around any component, then they are going to have access to my context. So the first value I am going to pass is the state. So I'm going to set up the state here. Let me collapse this. So I'm going to set up the state here. So I'm going to say constant, or can't even say use state. So state and then set state. Now this is going to use the initial state I have here. So the first value I am going to pass is my state, and as we actually added a type, we also have the actions we need to pass. So these actions: add layer, remove layer, set shadow property, and set container property. So let's add the functions. So const add new layer, this is basically going to be a void. It's the same as not writing it. We are going to have one for remove layer. So this is going to be remove layer. Is going to be set shadow property. And this is going to be set container property. Add new layer, remove layer, set shadow property, and then set container property. Alright, so I've passed all of them here. This is gone, but I need to make sure I'm passing the correct argument to these functions as well. I'm going to do that shortly, but let's implement the add new layer. So basically what it is going to do is it is going to call set state, and I'm going to pass previous state, and here another it is an object. So I am going to do dot previous state, and here I am going to update the box shadows. So it means the container props is not going to change here, because this is going to be adding a new shadow. So the box shadows list, I do previous state the box shadow, and then here is where I add the new shadow. So I do default box shadow props, which is basically this. So as you can see, I'm reusing the same thing here. That is why I do the spread, and here as well. So this is what our add new layer is going to do. It is going to add a new layer to the box shadows list. And for the remove layer, we are going to use the ID to target a layer and then remove it. So that is also going to be very simple. So as you can see from here, this extension is making the suggestion for me based on the name. So I'm going to accept that, and then I'll explain to you. So here I do set states previous states. Now I spread it again to keep the other states there, and the one I'm going to modify is the box shadows. So I'm going to do previous states dot box shadows, and I'm going to do a filter. So here it is going to say filter. I'm going to call it shadow just for clarity, shadow layer, and then it's going to check where the shadow layer ID is actually equal to the ID we are going to pass. And so here we have an ID, and then we pass a string. So here it is going to do a filter. So for set shadow property, I'm going to pass the ID, which is a string. It needs that. Now I need a shadow key as well, so shadow key. So here I am going to add the same generic type I added. So before this bracket, I can add key, extends key of iBox shadow properties, and I can now use k here. And then the value iBox, then I do k. So inside here, what I am going to do is this is for changing a box shadow property. So first of all, I'm going to say box shadows. So I want to get the box shadows list, and this is basically going to spread the box shadows from the states. So states dot box shadows. So I want to assign it a new variable called box shadows, and here is where I will modify the property I want to change. So I'm going to say index, and then box shadows dot find index using the ID. So I'd have shadow layer, where shadow layer dot ID is equal to ID. So I want to find the index of the shadow layer I want to modify, and here I'm going to do an if check and say if index is greater than -1, that is if we find an item. Then we want to modify the property. So with that, we do box shadow, and here we use the index to find that box shadow object, and then we use shadow key. So this is the shadow key we are going to pass. So in this case, it could be horizontal offset, vertical offset, blur radius, or the others. So we pass shadow key here, and once we do that, we assign it to the value. So this is going to modify the property, the box shadow property that we target using the index. So after it is able to find and update it, now we want to reset the state. I'll do the callback, and I'll still keep the previous state, and here box shadows is going to be spread of box shadows. That is, if I update it, I'm going to update it here, and I'm going to spread the results here. So that is what my set shadow property is going to basically do. And then set container property is going to do something similar, but because this one is just an object, it's not a list, we're actually not going to find any index, so we are only going to do the set states like this. So we do set states. I'm going to add a generic type here as well, and then I need to pass the parameters. So we need the key and then the value. So we do set states, spread the previous state, and then the container props this time instead of box shadow props. So we are going to update the container props to spread everything, and then wherever the key matches the one we pass here, we should update the value using the value here. Right. So this is going to be our context with all the actions we are going to dispatch. So this is going to dispatch add new layer, remove a layer from the layers list. This is going to update any box shadow property we adjusted the slider for, and then this is also going to do same for the container property. Right. So when I do this, I can now use the context provider inside app. So here I can now put it here, and then once I import it, it should be available for all my components I'm going to be creating. So for example, I have this component, so I can start using it in this particular component. So here, instead of using actual states, instead of using the use state here, I'm going to use the use context. Like this. And I am going to pass app context, and here it is returning an object, not an array. So I have state here. So as you can see, my state is I box shadow state. So if I want to get the box shadows, now I have to do dot box shadows. Right, and then for this button which says add new layer, I'm going to also get the add new layer action here, and then on click I just call this action, and this function does not accept any parameter, so I'll just call it like this. So let me save the app as well. Now if I do Ctrl Alt O, it should clean my import. And yeah, let me try and add a new layer and see. So I'm going to collapse this, I'm going to click on this, and as you can see, I have a new layer with the default box shadow props set. So this is working okay, and we want to also test the remove layer with this button. So when we go here, we are going to use the use context here as well. So I'm going to first of all say remove layer is equal to use context. I intend to do that. And I will pass up context. And then on this button, this is the delete button. So on this button, I'm going to add an on click, and here I'm going to pass it as a callback because I would need the ID, the layer ID passed. So call the remove layer action, and then as you can see, it accepts an ID. So here I will do layer dot ID, and I also want to do something. I want to actually disable this button. I don't want the button to be able to delete if I have only one layer, right? So if I have just one layer here, I don't want it to be able to delete that layer so that it will be empty. So I'm going to add a disabled state. So I'm going to say disabled, and here I'm going to choose the state. So let me get it from here. So let me get it from here. So I'm going to say states dot box shadows dot length is equal to 1. Right, so if it is equal to 1, then disable it. So if I save it and I expand this, I should be able to delete one of these. So let me delete the first one. I can see this is gone, like all the two deleted. So let me see why. If I go back to my context. Alright, okay, so the issue is coming from here. So because I'm using the default box shadow props, it is all the time going to use the same ID for them. That's why when I click on deleted, it deleted the two because their IDs are basically the same. So what I have to do is, after I spread this, I have to update the ID for the new box shadow layer that I am adding. And so I'm going to do ID and then call a new instance of UID here so that this will generate a new one. So once I save it and I add two shadows, for example, so I have two shadow layers added here. So I'm going to try and then delete one. I'll delete the first one, so this is now one. Now once I decide to delete this, so as I click on it, it does not delete because the button is disabled, so it is not actually working. And I can add a new one, and now when I click on it, it's going to disable. I'll be left with one. Alright, so this is working okay. The add and remove layer working fine. We are going to try and dispatch the actions for these properties as well. I'm going to go to shadow layer here, and I will need the set shadow property action. I'm first of all going to need it for whenever the slider actually changes, right? So here, if I call this function, for example, like this here, what I need is the ID, the key, and then the value I want to change. Right? And for now, we only have the value being passed by this function from the sliders we have down there. Yeah, from these sliders, as you can see, we only pass the e, and then we can get a value by doing e.target.value. So how do we actually also know the ID and then the key? We can still pass it from here. So we know the key is going to be we know the key for this one is going to be this, right? So they all have their individual keys we want, and from here we can also get their IDs. Alright, so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the key for each of these. I need to make sure this is accepting the key. So key is going to be key of box shadow properties. So once I do that and I do this, you should know like the keys, and this one is going to be horizontal offset. So yeah, I fixed it for the others as well, which means I can get the ID from the layer here as well. So here I can do layer dot ID, I can pass the key, and then I can pass the value, which is going to be this. And these are supposed to be numbers, so the values are going to be numbers, so I am going to just say number just to convert them to numbers. So I can clear the console log. So if I save it and I try to adjust one of these, as you can see it's working because the state is updating and the onChange event is also kicking in, right? Can change it for this as well. And if I show you my states, so I'm going to go here, I'm using React Developer Tools. Let's go to component, and here I'm going to click on shadows, go to the hooks, and then I'm going to open shadows. At the moment I have only one shadow layer. So if I change the horizontal offset, for example here, as you can see 11 here. If I change it to -48, I've got -48 here, and same for vertical offset, which means my state is updating correctly. So if I change the color is not even changing because we are not actually updating the state yet. So for the color picker here, which is saying handle color change here, I'm going to actually handle it. So as I showed you, this one is accepting an RGB color, so we are going to use the RGB color to set our color for the shadow layers. So here I showed you the output of color results, right? And it's having a hex color code, it's having RGB color code, and the others. So what I can do is I can do constant, let me just say res, let me just say RGB, and then I'm going to say color res, I'm going to say color results dot, then I'll get RGB. If I show you how it looks like in the console again, yeah, RGB, and then we have the individual properties. There's the alpha, RG, and then a B, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to destructure those. So I get a RGB and then the A from colorres.rgb. And here I can say set shadow property. I need to pass layer.id, and then the key I want to update is the color, and the value, so I want to say RGBA, right, and then the value is supposed to be my RGBA color. Right, so because I have it here, I'm supposed to pass the numbers here. For example, maybe I can say 255, 65, I can say 78, and then I can pass 0.9, something like this for my RGB color, right? So this is for R, this is for G, this is for B, and this is for alpha. So I'm going to replace it with this. So once we do this and I save it, I go here, I try to change it. As you can see, it now changes. Right. So if I increase the alpha as well, see it here, and you can see the color to here. Right. Alright, so this is working fine now. Our color picker is also working, which means the only thing we have to update is this insert property. So that is going to be down here, and it's a checkbox. So here I'm going to add it in line here. Right, so I'm going to say on change. I'm going to pass a callback. I'm going to do E here. Here is where I'm going to do set shadow property. So I need the ID first, so I'm going to say layer.id, and I also need the key, which is going to be active insert. After that, I need the actual value. So the way I'm going to do the actual value is I'm going to do e dot target dot checked. So this is a checkbox, so I can check for the checked property. So if I click on check, it means I want to use insert, so I'm going to pass insert. Otherwise I want to just leave it as empty so that it will not be insert. Alright, so once I save this, I need to also make sure I am setting the checked value, and the way we do it is to checked is equal to, now I am going to do layer dot active insert is not equal to null, and layer dot active insert is not equal to empty. Alright, so when I click on it, then it's going to check it if it is not null and it's not empty. So once I save it, I should be able to check it now, and then uncheck, check, and uncheck. And if I check here for active insert, right now it is unchecked, so it is empty. Once I check it, as you can see here, it's updated to insert. So that's how we are going to be updating our properties. Let me close this. Which means that we are now able to update all our shadow properties from here. Alright, so let's now add our preview container here so that we are able to see a live preview of when we are adjusting these sliders on our container. So I am going to basically close some of these, and inside here I am going to create a new file. I'm going to call it container. So I'm going to add some classes here. I'm going to add some Tailwind classes here. I'm going to say h full. So this is basically going to be the wrapper container, and I want to make it a flex container so that I will place the actual box inside it, in the middle of it. So I'll say h full, width full. I'll make it flex, and then I will just do flex call to make sure the direction is column. I do justify center, align items center, and I am going to do overflow auto. So let's bring this down, and then here I'm going to add a div. this is going to be the box we are going to apply the shadow on, right? And here, first of all, I'm going to basically going to use the use context here. So just generate that, then I'll destructure the state, pass up context, and then I will import this. We are going to first of all say we want to apply the styles on it, right? So for the styles, we know that the container props are going to contain, so if I show you the context again for how our state looks like from here, so we can first of all pass these ones. So I'm going to do dot state dot container props. When I save it and I go to app, and here where I have the preview, I'm going to use container, save it. Alright, so we have it here, has a width 200 and then height 200, basically the default container props we are passing, and it should actually be in the middle. I don't know why it's not in the middle, so let me actually check why. Alright, so I think I have this comma here. Alright, and it's now in the middle. Alright, so our container props is getting applied. We also want to pass the box shadow properties, and with that I'm going to use a use effect, and here I'm going to do state. So once the state changes, I want to say constant box shadow. So what I want to do is, now if I show you the finished app again, as you can see from here we can use them as individual properties as I've done here, but here as you can see we have these as individual properties. So the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, the blur radius, and then the spread radius, as well as the color, we have these as separate properties, but this should be combined as one string and then pass it to the box shadow property, CSS property. And then we also want to generate a code for the WebKit box shadows as well. Alright, so here we are going to use a helper function to help us do that, and it's a very simple help function. So inside SRT, I'm going to create a new file called helpers.ts. I'm going to paste this here, and on top of this I'm also going to paste this here. Alright, so let me import these types. And basically what this helper function is doing, so we are going to use this get stringified shadow layers, and what this is doing is it actually we are passing box shadow props to it, and here it is actually doing a map, and then it is adding the, so it is combining the active insert, the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, the blur radius, the spread radius, as well as the color. So basically here it is going to return a string. Right, so we do show list which maps them, and then get shadow string. It's basically going to combine them into one string, and then when we have multiple shadows we are going to do join and join them using the comma. Right, so from here, if I add, as you can see here, if I add another layer, we have a comma here, and then this is the other box shadow properties. Alright, so that is basically what this join is doing. So very simple. So once we have the helper function inside container, we can actually do get stringified shadow layers, we are going to pass state dot box shadows, and here we want to generate the style. So constant style, which is going to be CSS properties. So I'm going to set the box shadow style. So box shadow, and then it's going to be this box shadow. And here I'm also going to set the web kits and then the Moz box shadow. So I'll do web. So let me just say style. Right, and here I need to find a way to set the box shadow, like the actual box shadow style we are going to pass here. So I'm going to use a state. Alright, and then we update it down here. So once we do that, it is going to be set here once the state changes, and we can do comma dot box shadow style. So because we don't have any content in here, we don't actually need this. We can do self-closing, and then once I save it, as you can see, the box shadow properties are being applied, and this is insert. So if I remove it, as you can see, it's gone down. Alright, and this is very, very cool. And so if I reduce the spread radius, and if I change the color, right, so now this is working. Our container preview is working correctly. So let's also go ahead and add the container property settings here so that we can change the width and height and then the border radius of the container. So for that, we are going to create a new component, so a new file, and I'm going to call it container properties, or I could have called it container settings, but yeah, let me just say container properties. And in here you can use a fragment, and inside here I'm going to have the heading using h1. So this is going to say container properties. I'm going to add some styles. So text LG, font bold, margin bottom 5, text center. So once I save it and I open up.tsx, here I can start using container properties. So when I come here, as you can see, the heading is here. So the next thing is I'm going to add a color picker. So I'm going to have a div, and here I add the label using p color. Actually, let me call it background color. I'm going to add a pattern y of 2, and I'm going to use the color picker here again. I'm going to use my use context and get a state. So let me just say use context. First of all, import it, and then I'll generate it app context. Then I want to get a container props. Alright, so I can do another one, const, and I can also destructure the container props from state. So here our color picker needs the color, so we can do container props dot color, basically background color, and then we also need the on change. Alright, so the on change, we are going to get a color and then set the color. We're basically going to add a handle color change here. We actually receiving the color results if I import the type, and this time we are not getting the RGB, we are using a hex color code for our container, and that's because I wanted to use different options. So this time I'm using the hex color code. So here we are doing set container property, which is basically going to come from our set container, our use context state, and here we are passing the key, which is the background color, and then passing the color code, which is this hex. So here I am going to pass the on change. Right. So once I save this, I should come here and see this here, and when I change it, it actually changes the background color of my container. Alright, very cool. It's working okay. So the next thing is I'm going to use my sliders. So I'm going to have 3 sliders, one for the width, height, and then for the border radius. Right. As we did previously, we pass the key and then the E, import this, and here we call set container property. We pass the key and then the value, which we are changing to number. And so here is where we pass the key width, height, and then the border radius. And then on a slider we pass the main value, the max value, and then the actual value, which is coming from container props dot the name, the value from the properties, border radius, height, and then the width. And we also pass the label as well. Right. So once we save this, we should come here and then see our sliders showing here, and then when we adjust, it is actually updating the state, and our container is picking the updated values from the state. As you can see, you can change the border radius as well. Yeah, so this is very cool. So you get a catch, right? So you can generate multiple box shadows, and as you can see, we have all the settings in place. We have the preview working. We are now going to add the code editor here, where we actually see the code, the CSS code, and we can copy and then use it wherever we want to use it. So with that, I am going to create the last component. So here, going to add a new file. I will call it CSS code.tsx, and let's just use it already. So here we are going to use it after container properties. So say CSS code. We are going to save this. Let's come here. So we have the placeholder here. So I can bring this one to the side so that we can actually see the preview here. So we are actually going to use Monaco editor. Monaco editor is actually the editor that powers VS Code. So if you love using VS Code, Monaco editor has like almost all the features that VS Code has. We already installed the package for that. So if we check our package.json, we have at Monaco editor React here. So we are going to use the React package, the Monaco editor React package. I'm going to say import, and it is a default export, so I'm going to say M for Monaco, and I'll say editor from, and then we do at Monaco editor React, and then inside here I can use that mu editor, and here is where I need to pass the options. So the first property that accepts is options, and basically here is where you pass the editor options, so how you want your editor to be like. So there are lots of options you can actually pass. When you go to their documentation, you're going to see like all the options you can pass. So what I do is I copy the options from their documentation, and then I will modify the ones I want to change. So let me bring in that options because it is a lot. I'll go to helpers and I'll paste that here. Alright, so as you can see, this is editor options, and there are a lot of options here. So if you want to learn more about Monaco editor, I have recorded a YouTube video where I show you how to create an HTML and CSS editor from scratch. So I go through some of these options, so you can check it out. You would see the notification pop up at the top right corner there, so be sure to check it out after this video. But yeah, so these are all options you can actually modify. So for example, if you want to enable the code length, you can actually set it to true. Things like auto indent, auto closing brackets. So which ones are easy? Format on paste options, if you want to enable, you can set it to true. Folding, you can set it to true so that you can actually enable these features. Things like rulers, word wrap, and the one I modified is this one, read only. So when you set read only to true, it means your editor is going to be read only and you cannot actually click in it to edit your code. If you set it to false, which is the value by default, you can actually type something in your editor, right? So here I am also going to add the type. So I import star as Monaco from this part. Once I save it and I come here, I can do dot editor options, import it and use it here. If I save this and I wait for this to refresh, as you can see, it is loading my editor, and there you go. So we actually have something showing here. As you can see, there is a line showing here, but we can't see it because we need to actually set a height prop. So we are going to set a height and we are going to set it to 30 VH, and now we can see it. Alright, so I'm also going to set the language, and here we have a lot of languages that you can use in Monaco editor. I think it will be better if I show you the example on their website. Alright, so as you can see from here, Monaco editor React, so this is the example they have, and on the settings section here you can see the languages they support, which is a lot. Alright, so they support JavaScript, they support Markdown, MySQL, they have Java, HTML, GraphQL, Go, CSS, support other languages as well, and when you come down here, even TypeScript, right? So yeah, they support a lot of languages, so you are probably going to find your language if you want to use this editor. So we pass the language and then we also pass a theme for it. So in this case, this is a dark themed one, so what you pass a theme and it's called VS dark. As you can see here, you can also pass light, by default it is this light, so you can change the theme. So if I change it, you can see the different themes they have. Right. So based on the theme of your application, you can actually use the theme you want. So I'm going to leave it as VS dark, and that is basically what I am also going to use. So by default it is light. So here I pass the language as CSS, and also I'm going to pass the theme, and I'm going to say VS dark, and there you go, it has changed. So now, as I showed you, you see when I begin to type inside, it says cannot edit in read-only editor. So if I actually go back to the editor options and I change the read-only to false, now I can edit. Alright, so if I enter, this is a CSS editor, so if I enter something like h1, as you can see, I get some suggestions from here, and I can do something like background color. So you see the IntelliSense also suggesting properties for me because I set the language to CSS. It is able to suggest CSS properties for me, right? And I can actually do red. And when you do something like this, you also have the inbuilt color picker, same as we have in VS Code. Right, so this is a very cool editor you can actually use in your project. Alright, so we are not actually going to be able to edit stuff here. What we are going to generate here is what we are going to use here as the value. So I'm going to keep the read-only property set as true. So here we need to pass the value. So as you can see in VS Code, there is this minimap here. So when you write the code, you see this here. I actually want to disable that in my case, in this one. By default it is enabled, so I want to say mini map. You pass an object to it, and then you say enabled, you pass false. So here I am going to pass the CSS value, and with that I am going to do it up here. Right. And basically the value is supposed to be a string. So for example, I can say h1, right, like this, and I can say color is blue. So if I pass this as the value and I save it, right, as you can see it shows here. So here we are only going to pass a string value to it. So I'm going to create a state here, CSS set CSS, basically going to be a string. I like to add the type here, even though it's going to know from here. Now I'm going to say use effect, import it, and then generate it. And I am also going to use context here so that I get my state values. And then once I do that, inside my use effect, I can say box shadows, and then I'm going to use the get stringified box shadow layers here again. I'm going to do state dot box shadows. Now this is going to give me the box shadows. I also need the container properties for the width, height, border radius, background color. So I am going to do constant, use template string, and I'm going to do dot container. So this is basically saying I am selecting the container and adding the style. So it's just the CSS I am generating for that component, so that you can copy and then use it in your project, and then just add that class name to your element. CSS style, supposed to be CSS. And then in here I'm going to set a width. So the width is going to be state dot container props dot width, and then I'm going to add pixels to it, and then after that I put a semicolon here. So I do the same thing for the other properties as well. So this is going to be height, this is going to be border radius, and the CSS property is border dash radius. Here I do background dash color, and I get it from background color. Alright, so this is going to be the styles for the container, width, height, border radius, and then background color. And then the box shadow, it's going to come from box. The box shadow, the property, the key is box shadow. And then I do box shadows, which is basically this. This is already a stringified version. Alright, and I want to do the WebKit. So this is how we are going to, this is how our string is going to look like in the editor. The dependency is going to be state, and here we are going to do set CSS, and we do CSS style, which is basically this. So once we save this and then we pass CSS here, it's basically this. We save it. As you can see, we have our CSS showing in the editor. So the last thing I want to do, you would notice that when I come here and I try to update, you see the way this is actually flashing. So once I change it, it flashes immediately. Anytime I change any of these, this keeps on flashing like immediately. This is causing an update every time I move this, even continuously. I want to actually stop this continuous flashing, so I am going to add a timeout to actually wait a little bit once I am moving this, to wait for a second. When I stop moving this after 1 second, then it should update this one, so that there will be some kind of delay, so that once I continue to move this, it doesn't update this immediately. It will wait for me to finish moving the slider, and then after I'm done moving it, after just a second, it will update the values here, right? And that will make it a bit efficient to avoid performance issue. So I am going to put this in a timeout. So here I'm going to create a timeout. So I'm going to say constant timeout. I'm going to set it to set timeout instance. Pass a callback function, and then everything is going to happen within this curly braces, and then I'll pass 1000 milliseconds, which is basically 1 second. So here I want to put this whole update inside the timeout. It's basically saying that, okay, so once I move this, update it after 1 second, but if I move it like this, after 1 second it continues to flash, right? Even though I've not stopped, but once I stop along the way and continue to move, it will still flash, right? So that's where the cleanup actually comes in. So I need to make sure I am cleaning up the timeout, so that once I continue to move the slider, it does not update. It will clean it up, and then only when I stop and after 1 second I don't move it again, that's where it will actually update. So very easy to do with use effects. I do return callback function, and then here I do clear timeout, and I'm going to pass timeout. This. Alright, so once I do this, you would see that if I move this, once I continue to move, I stop a bit and I move again, it does not actually flash. Right. So unless I stop it, then after 1 second it does one flash to update it, and that is basically what we want. There you go. So yeah, this is basically looking good now. We have all the sections we need. The only thing we have to add is the functionality to be able to copy the CSS code. I mean, you can actually highlight it and copy, but we also want to make it a bit easier by adding a button at the top here to click on it to copy. So let's actually add that. So how do we actually click on it to copy this content? So we are going to use the package we installed called copy-to-clipboard. So if we check package.json, we have react-copy-to-clipboard. The way we use the components from that package is for this our button, we are going to copy to clipboard component from react copy to clipboard, and then we are going to wrap it around our button like this. And here, what do we want to copy? We pass it as a text, right? And basically we want to copy the CSS which we have up there, which is the same thing as what we are passing for our editor. So this is what we want to copy. And you can also add things like on copy. It is basically going to trigger an action when you copy. So I can have something like a toast, and then when I click on copy, it is going to show copied to clipboard up here. So you can do that on the on copy function, on copy prop for the copy to clipboard component. So this way I can say on copy to keep it simple. I'm just going to do console.log and I'll say copied. Alright, so when I save it and I come here, wait for this to refresh, and I come here, I try and then open the console. So once I click on copying, as you can see, copied. So if I try to paste it here, there you go, we have the content copied to clipboard, and you can paste it anywhere you want. Very, very simple. Alright, so I think we are basically done. If we check the responsiveness as well, right? So on mobile screen it also looks okay. So we have this one, and we have the preview section showing here, and we also have the container properties basically. So yeah, it looks good. So what we want to do is for this one, because it is actually the last section, we want to avoid this extra scroll bar on smaller devices, right? So what I am going to do is I am going to go to app, bring this here, going to go to up, and then here, as you see, I did H96. I am going to actually remove this one because I want to change the height. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add bg-slate-100 here, and I also need the pattern 5, but here I'm all the time going to do H4 like this. So once I do that, as you can see, the extra scroll bar is gone. So if it is the last item, yeah, it should actually expand down without any extra scroll bar on the container itself. With this one, it is fine because we are going to add more layers, and it is likely going to be very long, so we can keep the scroll bar here, but it all works fine, as you can see. Alright, so as you can see here, the only thing I am missing is maybe a background for this. When this is expanded, this is a bit hard to see that it is an accordion. So I'm going to add a background for my accordion triggers, and if I inspect this for my accordion, so it's called collapsible, and then in here there is the collapsible trigger, as you can see here. Alright, there is a collapsible trigger class, as you can see here. So this is what I want to target, and then add a few styling to it. I'm going to come here, go to app.css, and I'm going to paste these few stylings here. So I'm targeting collapsible trigger, and I'm changing the background color to this. I want to make the display block so that it will be full, it will have a full width. So when I save it and it refreshes, as you can see here, now it looks like an actual accordion trigger. Right, so I can click on it, add more, and yeah, it looks cool now. Alright, so with that done, it means everything is done. We are done building our CSS Box Shadow Generator application. Hopefully you found it helpful, so don't forget to like the video if you found this helpful. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any video or project I post in the future. And thank you for watching this video, and I am going to see you in the next video.